when you mention things like Freemasonry, it was a real force in the 19th century. So much so there was an anti-Freemasonic party. People talked about it. Nevertheless, in terms of 20th century, you run the risk of mystifying, over mystifying it. Meaning, was it just these guys hanging out at the Masonic temple? You can see it because basically, the United States, if you do the history of this, is the elite, the East Coast elite, which formed in the 19th century. There was always an aspiring oligarchy, along the eastern seaboard. And we saw even the early days of right after the Revolution, with Alexander Hamilton and his plan for the national bank, controlled by financiers who were connected to the Bank of London. Things like the international slave trade. I talked about the intrigues in and around the so-called American Civil War. But you saw with the development, the Russell Trust, Yale University, the Clipper ships, the opium trade, sort of these Americans who sort of insinuated themselves into this lucrative opium trade, and the development of the Clipper ships, which could travel, was it 3 times as fast or something, make 3 visits to China. Yeah. So that was a sort of an example of technology sort of changing things. So you had this vast fortune develop around the opium trade, which, by the way, Yale University was endowed. The Yale was a guy who worked for the British East India Company, was engaged in the opium trade. That's the foundation. And you have the development of Skull and Bones, a secret society on the Yale campus. A handful, I think a dozen a year are selected, and these people would be selected. And these people were families like the lodges,
Freemason
Russell.
was just completely all through.
Yeah, so it's all very secretive, and all kind of enwrapped in sort of a degeneracy and also a ritual. And this is a psychological to get people, to identify to the group, and it's in many ways Luciferian satanic if you get into it, because it's again, and which is it came out of the Illuminati. These things that in fact, some of the rituals I think were borrowed from the Illuminati because Russell went over there in the 30s or 40s and picked this up from Bavaria and brought it back and then incorporated into the Russell Trust and Skull and Bones. And Russell Trust was financed the Skull and Bones. Now, Skull and Bones for the longest time would supply the cohort of the American intelligence elite foreign policy of the early 20th century. And then you had, in the aftermath of the First World War, you had these families like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. They formed, I think in England was the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and its analog in the United States was the Council of Foreign Relations. And these were the experts in foreign policy. At the time, the American government was relatively innocent and non-interventionist. So when the American government expanded greatly in the 1930s, 1940s, they provided the personnel for their foreign policy establishment. At the time, it was largely a WASP project, but there was always the WASP-Jewish alliance. And as I mentioned, as early as the First World War, you saw sort of Jewish power flex its muscle and manipulate U.S. foreign policy. And you see this in the 1930s and 40s with America's position with Germany. Became anti-German because of largely Jewish influence, and also Anglo-American, largely the broader Anglo strategy of the Mackinder Doctrine in controlling affairs on the continent, preventing any major power from developing. In the 19th century, it switched from France to Germany. England became anti-German, whereas the 19th century was mostly anti-French because they saw French as the principal European power. And so as Germany developed, it became the Mackinder Doctrine was developed, and Germany became the target. And you had the 30 Years' War, World War I and World War II, and the destruction of German independent power on the continent after the Second World War. In the 1950s and 60s, you had sort of the WASP domination of foreign policy. You could say that immediately after the Second World War, the WASP sort of beat back the Morgenthau Jewish Zionist element, and the WASP took over. And you had the Korean, Dean Acheson, you had the Korean War and these things. But nevertheless, you had this sort of the growing Jewish power in the United States in the 1950s because of one thing, the expansion of media, Hollywood, electronic media, television. It was all Jewish operated and controlled. C.D. Jackson, his new name is C.D. Jacobson. Time Life, although it was controlled by Henry Luce, a lot of Jews were involved in it. In the 1960s, it was slowly taken over and used for the purposes of Jewish power, particularly after 1967 and late 70s. You have sort of the demise of the WASP elite and the ascendancy of the Jews. So you had sort of what's called a circulation of elites within the American power structure. You had a sort of a quiet revolution. And you had also Jewish cultural ascendancy because they're able to exploit America's liberal system A lot of Jewish agitation in the law. They're good at this. At least a cohort of them are, and they use sort of litigation and legal agitation to do away with local rule. The 14th, we talk about the 14th Amendment, at least its
Right,
interpretation of the 14th
right.
Amendment, the destruction of local anti-obscenity laws, the application of the First Amendment to obscenity, pornography, and also with electronic media, with the culture war, to promote a popular culture which promoted degeneracy and sort of atomization of society under the cover of integration, the smashing of ethnic neighborhoods, the rise of suburbia, economic developments. Like one thing is the extension of credit, inflation, going into debt, consumerism. All these things play into this, and that's why it's so difficult to understand. Sort of the distorting and retardation of American society and the American economy, all transformed America from a broadly Christian Protestant nation in 1900 to a broadly a Judaic nation culturally by the year 2000. Well, probably by 1970, but it was completed by 2000, and you get the war on terror and the Iraq War. And when you have overt Jewish domination, the neoconservatives, all the intrigues that led to the Iraq invasion, exploiting all the hysteria of 2001 and these things. So it's kind of like, whoa, wow, where we're going about our affairs, raising our family, trying to get an education, pay our bills, and these schemers are taking over U.S. foreign policy and bankrupting
Well,
the country and destroying its reputation.
and it was to be expected because I think they've obviously been in the background and certainly have had the majority of our political power since the beginning of the creation of the country, and we get bamboozled by the terms that they identify themselves with. You can see it, first of all, from like the Knights Templar going
Mm-hmm.
back. Well, what that name, I mean, like what is the actual origin and ethnic composition and purpose of the group? The group then morphs into Freemasonry, right? It
Mm-hmm.
changes its name after it's being attacked, by Catholicism. De Molay is burned, in the steps leading up to Notre Dame. But then it changes its name; it becomes Freemasonry, and you go forward, you can say, well, you have like Skull and Bones and Bohemian Grove, right? These are, you can just see from the political kind of manifestations of the organization and financial manifestations
Well, it's
that
where
the
it's at Skull and Bones, and there are various get-togethers in their island up there, and
yeah.
where the island was it what's that island called again?
Oh yeah, forget it. But
Deer
anyway,
Island. Deer Island.
yeah, I
Yeah.
forget. Anyway, but my point, my
And also, my point is, it's there, and also in Bohemian Grove, where foreign policy decisions are made, and it's not made
sure,
in Congress or in
of
committee
course not.
hearings
I
or
mean,
you know,
the atomic
or the
bomb.
National Security Council for that matter.
Right, but Bohemian Grove was the organization that decided to develop the atomic bomb,
Mm-hmm.
something in fact which they now brag about openly. But what I was saying is that these organizations are no longer functioning in that form. I mean, they're turning into basically Bohemian Grove is becoming like a dinner society.
Yeah, I mean, when they created CIA in 1947, that was sort of a consummation of this untoward between the state and these sort of secret interests. So you didn't have to
Right.
sort of formalize, same way it was formalized with the creation of Israel.
Exactly right. So they're transitioning from like kind of extra government controlled secret societies to just overt secret societies inside of government, like the CIA and the FBI.
So are they
But
secret societies anymore? They're open secret
well,
societies.
but the whole government is a secret society at this point. But
Well, now
because
because of secrecy laws, which you don't have, by the way, but because of the Byzantine national security state is effectively a secret society because there's no effective oversight or public accountntability. Yeah. Good
well,
example is Biden just launches a war against the Houthis, and there's no like congressional inquiry or even a request for a declaration of war. Presidents can just launch unilaterally, start these wars now in the name of protecting commerce.
yeah, I mean the democratic aspect of our government is lost. We
That
just have
started in 1950 with Korea, right?
we have kind of a dictatorship now. The president just does whatever he wants in
Yeah, I think
terms
the
of
last time the United States government declared war was 1942, I think, against Romania.
yeah,
Which
that was a good
was
one. But anyway,
yeah,
so
so,
so
but
but
wait,
we
so basically, if that's the case, we've been at peace since 1942.
right in a wonderful period. But the point is that the public is confused by the changing of the names. You change from, the Masons to Bohemian Grove.
How
Suddenly
about the
these
War Department to the Department of Defense?
exactly. So they are constantly changing the referent because they know that in the minds of the public, they would see something different and new, and then they don't get focused upon what is in back of these agencies because they keep changing their names all the time.
Hmm.
Public needs to start thinking about the long-standing application of this hidden hand that controls our foreign policy. I mean,
Hmm.
that's why I always, I try to take the broadest possible context in describing these things, going back, to the Revolutionary War, and then looking at the Vietnam War as another example of it. It's inexplicable as a kind of coherent foreign policy. It doesn't have any real there's no a reason that the US was threatened by, the Viet Minh or something like this. It's just these are ludicrous ideas, but there's this idea of depopulation and the idea of psychological traumatization, because that's another one of our the aspects of the hidden hand, is that they traumatize the individuals or move them into, emotional and psychological cul-de-sacs, like, the youth culture and the communes with LSD on one hand, and the people fighting in the Vietnam jungle on the other. I mean, this is traumatizing the generation. Generation isn't going to be able to really stand up against, the oligarch control of government, because it has its own individual personal problems it's got to be dealing with. I
Hmm.
was there, I saw all this. So this is the thing that I would hope is like one of the first steps, is just to realize that they change the names of the organizations, but we always have to bring the same wisdom, which is to say our experience or understanding of how the foreign policy has been manipulated from the very beginning to the current situations, to, like the business with the Houthis, for
Hmm.
God's sake. What is the US, if we start engaging in warfare with them, is this really in the interest of the public? You know, to actually stop the Houthis from being, a political power. I mean, we have to always think about the hidden hand, and try
Well,
to
also
understand.
why these wars are being prosecuted. Like, a good example is, say, the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Now you can have the Israelis, they're supposedly attacked or caught by surprise by the Egyptians and the other Arab states, and the Nixon administration, I guess with Kissinger whispering into his ear, comes to the aid of Israel and bails them out. But the war itself supposedly sparks the Arab oil embargo, which causes now were the Saudis or OPEC ever really independent of the Western powers, particularly the United States? I don't think so. Therefore, with no military power, you're not independent. That's just the way it is. So we have this whole narrative where this is a response, but this causes oil prices, the oil shocks, to go up. Price. I think the price of oil shoots up 400%. It's overnight makes several oil projects, particularly in Alaska and the North Sea, profitable for the oil companies. It also causes the energy crisis. Uh, the it stops third world development in its tracks and causes them to go into debt, which eventually causes the third world debt crisis, which is used as sort of that economic model to further impoverish the third world, keep it from developing, because it was perceived as a threat to Western domination, particularly continued Western domination on the planet, because they didn't want the third world to develop on its own. And so, in 1973, were the Israelis being used for that, or were they part of it? Because there was, I think it was that plan was actually proposed at the 1972 Bilderberg meeting. At least that's what's reported in Sweden that year. They needed an oil crisis or a crisis to cause the oil prices to go up 400%.